Hey YouTube, today I want to talk about some various techniques or approaches to staying warm during a power outage. Some of these things I'm about to say are very common sense. You may know about some of these, but there are some people who may not really have thought much about this. There's a large number of people here in the US that rely on central air. And what I mean by that is like all their heating and cooling needs to be met via electricity. I mean, there are a lot of people who have no backup systems. They just rely on the electrical grid. And if they don't have that, they're in trouble. And this is of a great concern. And so I'm a big proponent to have backup systems and not to rely on just one thing ever. Because you know what? Things happen, and you could be caught in a situation that you'll need heat and you don't have it. And you could have some serious outcomes. So the first thing I want to say would be to keep a good stockpile of blankets. And I mean like wool blankets if possible. The closer to 100% wool, the better, in my opinion. So blankets, and also to have some really good clothing. Wool clothing as well is awesome. If not, maybe like polar fleece, which is typically made up of a high percent of polyester. You can get some very thick polar fleece. I would go with that, just to have it in reserve. And the trick here, regardless if you're just wearing clothes or if you're just going to be trying to get under blankets, or if you're doing both, which both is good, you know, you don't really want to be naked under covers. I mean, especially if you're really cold. So you want to do all this in layers. You want to layer up your clothing, and you also want to layer up your blankets. And especially though, when you're talking about clothing, it's not bad to have a little bit of room inside, so that you can trap some air. That's good. So the way that this all works is that our bodies put out heat, right? And our bodies basically stay warm when the heat that our body makes can get reflected back off of whatever the environment is back to us, especially if there is no other heat source. A lot of people say, boy, these blankets or these clothes are so warm. But it's not really that the blanket is warm, because the blanket doesn't put off heat, right? And it's not our clothes that are warm. Our clothes don't generate heat. What it is just reflecting the heat from our body back to our body. So that's what's really going on here. So, you know, you want something that can help trap air and also help to reflect the body heat back to us, so that we can warm ourselves more effectively and efficiently. So when it comes to other things like having thermal underwear, I mean, it's a real given. It's a real given. You want to have some of that. Thermal clothing overall, sure. Winter clothing, you know, do you want to have things that are made for low temperatures? And there's so many options. It's just the sky's the limit. You know, you can easily do some research and see that there's anything that you would want is available out there. Gloves and hats, just remember that, you know, that some of our heat does escape through our head. Also, you want to keep our limbs and extremities warm. You don't want to have numb fingers and get into frostbite conditions or hypothermia of any type. You just kind of protect all of your body parts. Now, there is a technique, though, using an emergency blanket, and they make lots of different types. A lot of people don't understand that there's so many different types of emergency blankets. When I say that, typically people think of the space blanket or some type of a foil or mylar blanket that you typically see for $1 or $2 at a big box store. But they actually have sportsman blankets that are a lot more heavy duty, and they typically have on one side reflective surface to help reflect back your body heat, and the other side is a bright coloration, at least some of them are, for signaling for help. But these things are thicker, and they typically are a lot more efficient at holding in body heat and reflecting in body heat. So you could wrap up with one of those. That could possibly help. Or if that's all you have is just a standard Mylar space blanket, that's better than nothing. And what you can do is that you can wrap yourself and then put a blanket around that. Some people put the Mylar space blanket on top of all their covers to help trap even more air in. So that's a good way as well. That's probably how I would do it. Now, in terms of like hand warmers, they also have like feet warmers and just different types of warmers. You can actually stick them under your armpits though, in your groin area. You can put them on your chest. You can put these all over the place, under your hat. So you can take, your feet and your hand warmers, and these are basically just like little contraptions that have like a little chemical reaction, and they last a number of hours, and they can just put out heat. And that can help you kind of just be more comfortable. It may not be the fix. It may not be enough to really keep you warm, like especially if you're in a very cold environment. But if you're in your house and the power goes out, this is going to be a big help, right? The next I want to say is movement and exercise. Now, you don't want to go so far that you're starting to sweat. That's a bad thing because sweat actually can cool your body down. And so you want to just move enough that you're not sweating, but you're generating some body heat, a lot more body heat than you were before. And that'll keep you warmer. But there's a problem with that because you're burning calories. And so the solution, it's a very simple solution, is to eat more. And so this is a really good thing as well. Even if you don't do a lot of movement and exercise, which I do recommend, just once again, don't do so much that you're starting to sweat. But you should increase your calorie intake because your body needs more calories to make more heat, right? To generate all that, to become a little furnace. And so, if you feel a little cold, just eat a little food and you'll be surprised. Sometimes the chill will go away. The next thing I want to say is that you can share your body heat with others. Now, if you live alone, obviously this is a problem. But a lot of people do not live alone. And, if you, let's say you have a spouse, you could always snuggle up with your spouse and share body heat. And that's been known to help, especially if you're like under covers or under some type of reflective material. Candles. I would try to pick a smaller room in the house and close that room off. And you can set up some candles around you. And believe it or not, it can really increase the ambient temperature of a room. Anywhere from like 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees even. It can't, work miracles. It's not going to be like, okay, in 1 hour, these 4 candles are going to increase the room temperature by 20 degrees. I don't know about all that. It just depends on how powerful and large your candles are, I guess. But I can tell you, though, that it can definitely increase the temperature of the room in ways you might be surprised. So there's definitely that. Just be careful with candles, obviously. I would always use candle holders. But check this out. If you're in a really dire space, and, candles in the room isn't going to cut it. You definitely need more heat. If you have a pop-up tent, you can definitely set that up in a living room, or if you have a large enough bedroom, wherever you can set this up and set up a tent. Now, if you don't have a tent, you can just take some chairs and you can put some blankets over that and kind of make your own tent. But this is what I would do if I had an actual tent. And of course, you can modify this accordingly if you don't have one. But I would put down some blankets to help insulate the tent, right? And then if you have a Mylar blanket or some type of emergency blanket that it has a reflective surface or side, put that over top of the blankets that are over top of your tent. And then inside, light some candles. And that smaller space will allow the ambient temperature to rise that much more quickly. And that heat will become more trapped because you have basically insulation and reflective surfaces above. And you can get quite warm in a tent that way. So that's something that you could do in a real emergency. Now, let's move to the next thought here about this. And that is battery-powered electric socks. This is something that you could use. I've even seen like battery-powered, like electric gloves. I've never tried these devices. I'm sure it works for some people in some environments, but it is an option. I've seen them out there. What about the hot water that may still be available or accessible in a hot water heater. You know, in our houses, a lot of people have like 40 or 50 gallon hot water heaters. And when the power goes out, it doesn't mean that the water just goes cold immediately. You might have a few hours that you have some pretty hot water in there. So, I mean, it is an option that you could take a shower and use that hot water to warm you up. And then afterwards, dry off really well and layer up your clothes like we talked about earlier, and then get under some covers. And that could be a really good start to kind of keep you warm or get you more warm. Okay, so let's move here to the next idea, and that would be to make sure ahead of time, though, that your house is well insulated, that your doors and windows are sealed properly. That's a big problem. I go to a lot of people's houses and see that there's a big gap in their front door and the air just moves right through, or windows are old and they're not really that great. They're not very, efficient at all. And so this is something you have to take in consideration. If you have a traditional stick-built house, do you have enough insulation in the attic, for example? I mean, it's amazing, though, when insulation gets compacted or damp, it really, loses a lot of its effectiveness. The next thing I want to say is that propane heaters can be safe and effective in a home if you're careful. This is my least favorite thing to do. Like, I don't do this personally. But to advise, I would say that this is something you could use, but you have to be careful. Propane it's fairly clean in terms of it's not putting out like toxins per se, but it does really eat up the oxygen in a room. So if you have adequate air movement, some ventilation, you could possibly use this. So I would only use this really in a larger room that's connected to a hallway, maybe, or you have some air movement. Maybe even every once in a while, crack a window for a few minutes. This is something that I think it's important to make sure you have enough oxygen in the room. So I don't really want to focus on this one too much because I don't really like this one, but it is an option if you have no other option. Okay, another thing to consider is if you have like a solar collector, like if you have solar panels on your house or somewhere on your property that you can charge batteries, you can take those batteries and connect it to an inverter, and you can plug in like an electric space heater, and you could run that for a while. Obviously, try to put those put the space heater and the batteries and everything in one of the smallest rooms in your house. So you want to make that room the easiest as possible to heat up. You don't want to just try to heat up this massive room, like a large living room off of a small space heater. You'd probably want to go to the smallest bedroom, or even if you have like a walk-in closet, you could even use that. And that would be a lot easier to heat up than a larger room. The next would be, and this is just for me, my favorite option because it's so effective. And if you live in a location that this is, allowed, because I think there are some places that the building codes don't even allow for this anymore. But in some locations, it is still legal. And in my area, it's legal. And it's even better because I have a lot of property and a lot of trees. And every year, a few of the trees fall down naturally just because they get hit by lightning or a really bad storm tears them down. And so I have all this free firewood. I have more firewood than I could ever use in my life. I mean, just everywhere there's wood that I could chop up. And so a wood stove is just awesome. I've actually got it figured out that I can go from a code house to 20 minutes later, I can get the temperature 20 degrees hotter. That's how fast this works, for me. And you give it another hour and you could be 35 plus degrees warmer in the house. That's just how my situation is. It could vary depending on home to home and, wood stove to wood stove. And of course, it just depends on what kind of wood you're using too. Some wood burns hotter than others, but a wood stove is a very good thing. You can not only just warm up your house and keep yourself safe that way, but you can cook on it as well. And it provides light. If you open up the door of the wood stove, believe it or not, it puts out quite a bit of light. At least mine does. So you have that wood stove. It's my favorite option. I just love wood stoves. And I do want to say one more thing here. If you don't have a wood stove and you don't have some of the other options, maybe you don't have candles, maybe you don't have like an insulated blanket, or you have very few blankets, you don't have wool blankets, you don't have very good insulated clothing, and you're just doing the best you can, you might want to check to see if the basement in your home is warmer. And that might sound like contrary to belief, because you're like, the basement typically is cooler, right, than the house normally. But it is possible that it could be, especially if you have a section of your basement that is like underground or mostly underground, that the earth insulates, and it actually could be warmer than above ground. It's interesting how that works, but it's true. And this is even true as well for like storm shelters that are completely underground, or root cellars. Definitely want to check that out. It'll probably still be cool. But what I've noticed is that, especially like with root cellars that are completely underground, is that they typically have a consistent temperature year round, and it doesn't fluctuate very much. It might fluctuate maybe 5 or so degrees, but in my area, the average root cellar, it's between 58 degrees, plus or minus like 2 or 3 degrees up and down. So there's a fluctuation there, but on average, it's about like 58 degrees. More specifically, it's 58.5 degrees is what the actual ambient temperature for the average root cellar. But I think it's pretty interesting, I'm not saying that 58 degrees is warm and you're going to be all great, but that's not too bad considering, being in a cold house, which could easily get down into freezing, right? So it's just something to think about. And of course, you can always do things if you're in a root cellar and it's 58 degrees or even a little cooler to, once again, get warm in there as well. You can bundle up more if you do have candles. Most root cellars aren't that large, at least the ones that I've seen. So it wouldn't be the most difficult to add a few degrees to that root cellar if you had some candles. Just every once in a while, I would probably crack the door and just let a little fresh air in, just to make sure you have enough oxygen, because even candles, they use oxygen. So you don't want to be in a situation that you have, not enough oxygen or too much carbon dioxide in a space. So just be careful. I hope this helps, or at least this was somewhat interesting and gets you started. These are not all of the different ways to stay warm. These are just some of the ones that I thought about today and I wanted to share with you. You guys stay safe. Catch you later.